Okay, here's the second video lecture installment for Bridgemont Community and Technical College for lifespan development. We were talking at the end of the first video on gender about gender socialization, the process where people learn the behaviors and attitudes that are expected of their gender, remembering that sex is biological and gender is cultural. Margaret Mead, a famous anthropologist, so adjust my camera here one more time. There, almost got it. There we go. In the 1930s, Margaret Mead did some very famous studies on gender. Before this time, people thought that these stereotypical gender roles, I'm going to go back just for a few seconds here, of masculinity and femininity were biologically endowed. In other words, there was this thought that men were biologically born being strong, unemotional, providers, independent, dominant, etc., and that these were biological and not learned traits. Same for women. The idea was that women were biologically endowed being nurturing, domestic, weaker, etc. And Margaret Mead came along and said, not necessarily the case here. She challenged this biologically deterministic notion of gender. She studied 3 different tribes in New Guinea, and in one tribe she found essentially that both males and females were feminine by our standards. The men would wear makeup, they were very nurturing, they would engage in child care duties, taking on what we would consider to be very feminine roles. Another tribe, she discovered that both men and women were masculine. The women were also very aggressive in this tribe. They were warlike, typically possessing traits that we associate with being masculine within our society. And then in another area, she found that the gender roles were reversed. In other words, the men possessed stereotypically feminine characteristics, and vice versa. So this immediately starts to challenge the whole idea that men are just biologically born being, in control and assertive and dominant, and women are born being feminine and weaker and nurturing and all these other characteristics that we've talked about. The idea is that this stuff is actually taught, and if we were transplanted from our culture into one of these cultures, like say for this one, for example, men may turn out very differently in the Arapash tribe. Women may turn out very differently in the Mundugamor tribe if transplanted there and raised within that culture. So what influences how children learn gender roles? Well, parents, obviously. From a developmental standpoint, we know that parents have probably the greatest influence on their children from birth up into adolescence, for better or for worse. And we've talked about that in class before. From birth, fathers tend to interact more with sons than daughters, while mothers tend to interact more with their daughters than sons. That seems to be the trend. Mothers play traditional games like peekaboo, whereas fathers play more physical, rough and tumble activities. Example, a dad might urge his frightened son to jump off a diving board, saying things like, be a man, you can do it, but not be this way with his daughter. He would not be so insistent that his daughter jump off the diving board. He may say, well, that's okay, honey, it's all right. So parents treat their young boys and their young girls very differently, in accordance with the stereotypical gender roles, quite frankly. Peers. So we start to see, just this one more time. By the age of 3, most children's play shows the impact of gender stereotypes. Boys prefer blocks and trucks. Girls prefer tea sets and dolls. And children are generally steered into these gender-appropriate toys and activities by their parents and their peers as well. Young children are even more critical of peers who engage in cross-gender play. Boys playing with girls and girls playing with boys. Once children learn the rules about gender-typical play, they often harshly punish their peers who violate these rules. Some more on peers. Between the ages of 2 and 3, children begin to prefer playing with their same-sex peers. They spontaneously select same-sex playmates. Adult pressure is really not necessary here. It just kind of happens. Children resist parents' efforts to get them to play with mixed members or members of the opposite sex. Girls are often unhappy when their parents encourage them to play with boys, and boys are often unhappy when their parents urge them to play with girls. Television has an indelible influence on gender and gender socialization and subsequent development. Today, women on television still tend to be cast in romantic, marital, or family roles. If you think of the situation comedies, movies that you like, typically women are still cast in these very stereotypically feminine roles. They're depicted as being emotional, passive, and weak. Men on television tend to be cast in leadership or professional roles. And they are depicted, again, in these stereotypically masculine ways as being rational, active, strong, etc. Children who watch a lot of TV end up with more stereotyped views of males and females. Children who watch a lot of television prefer gender-typed activities to a greater extent than do children who are less avid viewers of television. So it goes to make the point that television does reinforce these gender stereotypes. And again, like we've been saying all along, subsequently how boys and girls develop as human beings. The notion of what is gender appropriate will change or vary over time in one place. And this is an example that I used last semester in my Intro to Psych class, so some of you may remember some of these. The example I always use is this one. In the 1700s in this country, male politicians were essentially drag queens, if you think about it. They wore silk stockings, powdered wigs, makeup. If you don't believe me, you can pause this and Google it, and you can see that I'm not making this up. If our male politicians came out today wearing high-heeled shoes and silk stockings and wigs and makeup, we would probably think there was something very wrong. We would have a problem with that, probably. In the early 1900s, young boys were photographed in dresses. I always ask my parents that I have in my classes, if you would take your young son to be photographed in a dress, and the answer is always no. Why would we do that? Well, in the early part of the 20th century, it was not uncommon at all for boys to be photographed in christening dresses. Another example might be female athletes. 40, 50 years ago, the idea of women playing professional sports was unheard of. The idea of girls wanting to play sports in middle school or in high school or even college was just not as possible as it was for men or boys to play in school or to play in college. There was this idea that it was not an appropriate role for women. Now, girls' athletics are just as popular, if not more popular, in some areas and in some high schools and even in some colleges. So we've seen sort of a turnabout. Again, the idea of gender varying over time in one place. Some example of colonial men's clothing from the 1700s. And I believe you have all of this word for word in your PowerPoint packet that I gave you. So I'm just going to kind of skip through these pretty quickly. But you can see, when you see words like, and I'm going to kind of show some of them here. If I'm a man and I'm looking in a catalog for clothes and I see words or phrases like, I'll point to, and you have this, you can see them: short skirt, silk stocking. That's probably gonna ward me off. I'm probably not gonna want to buy this kind of stuff. It's just kind of funny to see men's fashion back in the 1700s. This is what men aspired to wear. And again, you see terms like long-tailed skirt, small lace ruffles. Again, most guys aren't going to buy clothes when you describe them in that fashion. Hairstyles. You've got like literally pigtails and ribbons and what looks like a curler. I don't know. I don't think a lot of guys that I know would be going to the hairstylist asking for a disheveled crop in the negligee style, or hair that would be puffed, curled, or frizzed. So just the wording of this is kind of funny. Also, as we're starting to wrap this up a little bit, what is appropriate behavior or conduct for one gender may or may not be appropriate for the other. And we are socialized to this extent. And it does reflect and influence our human development. Example I always use is how men and women greet each other. Men, even if we know each other, we typically don't take a running start in the mall or out on the street and embrace each other, give each other a kiss on the cheek. There would be some obvious assumptions about our sexual orientation if we did so. It's okay for women to greet each other like this. We don't think much about it if we see two women maybe just kind of kiss each other on the cheek and hug and hold hands and run off to the bathroom together. We don't think much about that because we've been socialized, again, as men and women, to act in certain ways. It's not okay for me as a guy to ask my male buddy, "Hey, you want to go to the bathroom with me? Come on." It would be okay for girls to do that, as they seem to travel to bathrooms in pairs. But if a guy would do that with another guy, it would be seen as being very weird or inappropriate. But if you travel to a different part of the world, whereas in this country I wouldn't greet my male friend with a kiss on the cheek, in France or in parts of Europe it is very common for men to greet each other with a kiss on the cheek. Not unusual at all. So again, if you're taught this way and you don't know any differently, then you wouldn't think anything would be strange at all about two men kissing each other on the cheek as a way to greet each other. I'm going to skip the example of the rest area in South Carolina just for time purposes here, but you're getting the idea. Sexism. This is stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination that's based on gender. The idea that women and men can't do certain things. Women can't be police officers, or women shouldn't be firefighters. Men shouldn't be nurses, or men shouldn't be secretaries, for example. So we have these very specific gender stereotypes, and when people go against them, as you can see, the male hairdresser here, or the female construction worker, girls. This is Danica Patrick, the female NASCAR driver. Men who want to be nurses. We start thinking that this is strange, and then we immediately start making assumptions about their sexual orientation or their interests, and it's usually in negative kind of ways. Having said this, still, men generally dominate the building trades still. Again, the way you're socialized does affect your human development in terms of what you think about gender, how you think about yourself and the opposite sex, and also the kind of job that you're likely to have. So this idea of gender is pervasive throughout the developmental process for humans. 99% of brick masons, stone masons, heavy equipment operators are men. 87% of architects and engineers are men. Police officers, still 85% are men. Physicians and surgeons, 70% are men. So even now, in this advanced society that we live in, this enlightened period that we live in, we still see gender-dominated trades and occupations. Gender and occupation for women, still, largely, speech pathologists, dental hygienists, almost 100% are females. Preschool kindergarten teachers, 97.6% are women. Receptionists, 93.6% are women. Licensed practical nurses, still almost 94%, 93.3% are women. So we still see this very specific gender divide in occupation. So we can't ignore, again, the impact of gender and how we are socialized to think of gender, and then subsequently how it impacts our occupation. There's a lot of research about the adherence of men to masculine gender roles. Men especially feel like they have to fit into this masculine gender role box, and we think we have to be tough and unemotional and macho and all this, and most of us aren't really all of these things as men. This contributes to a lot of problems throughout the course of our development as men. Higher rates of depression, higher suicide rates, feelings of desperation, substance abuse, for example, physical health problems. So, there's a lot of problems that can be associated with trying to fit into the masculine gender role. And the same for women. Women also suffer from, I don't have a slide for it, unfortunately, but women also suffer from depression, from anxiety, substance abuse problems, some of the same kind of problems as men. And we're going to call this the end of that part. Thank you.